Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we are returning to hospitals to hear the horrors that happen within their walls. Don't forget that I post every night, so be sure to press the subscribe button and little bell icon to be notified, and come back tomorrow for even more horrors. But anyway, without further ado, it's time to get comfortable. Grab your scalpel and let the darkness take control. I used to work the graveyard shift at a 5-story hospital that had a haunted room on the second floor. It was room 220, and so many things have happened to patients in the past that used that room, that the staff eventually learned to just avoid assigning it to anyone. I would say 90% of the time, that room would always remain vacant, while every other room on the second floor would be assigned to 1 or 2 patients. The numerous complaints that I've heard in the past were from patients and staff that entered the room. They were as follows. 1. Indistinct giggling and laughter of children through the wall, even though both adjacent rooms were occupied by full-grown adults that were too drugged up on pain medication to wake up, let alone giggle. Number 2. Scratching on the bathroom door, like deep and long streaks. An adult woman crying would be the 3rd, and the 4th is cleaning equipment falling down or being knocked over. 5. Apparitions. A staff member got a bit frisky at work one night and snuck off with her boyfriend when he came to visit her. Guess which room they used? Yup, 220. Didn't turn on the lights and closed the door behind them to fool around. Not 10 minutes after we wondered where she disappeared to, you hear the most deafening shriek that ever graced the second floor, and they ran out of the room in horror. The female staff were hysterical, and her boyfriend was as pale as a corpse. Apparently just moments before they were about to get nasty on the bed, they saw a middle-aged man standing over them and staring at them. We called security, and they immediately began searching the room, and of course found absolutely nothing. The female staff member was reprimanded, and she avoided the second floor like the plague. Now for the story. This was told by a doctor who worked at the hospital for 15 years, and was apparently there when the incident occurred. Honestly, I feel like he was just dicking with us and read one too many creepypastas. But here it goes. Allegedly, 10 years ago, that room was assigned to a patient with late stages of juvenile onset Huntington's disease. The patient was a 28-year-old male that was pretty much transferred to us as a vegetable. The guy was on life support and seemed like he was only there so that his family could buy a few more days to decide whether or not to pull the plug. It sounds horrible, but then again it's a horrible disease. Anyway, one night while a nurse was making her stops and checking to see that everyone was still breathing, she finally gets to room 220, and there, standing half naked, was this guy, writing on the walls with his own blood. It wasn't even coherent words, but apparently scribbles of random signs and numbers and smeared body handprints were everywhere. The nurse freaked out and tried to make him stop, but he drew out a piece of glass and started brandishing it at her. She ran out the door and quickly called security. But when they came, the patient was already dead on the floor, lying in a puddle of his own blood. He severed his radial artery and bled out. Security called the police and they came to investigate the room and question the nurse, who was a nervous wreck at this point, and all the staff who were working that night as well. It was eventually ruled as a suicide, and the room was scrubbed clean. The poor nurse must have been traumatized for life. But since that day, they say that that room in particular has had strange happenings going on, and I would never conscript one of my patients to that room, ever. I used to be a surgical technologist. We were doing a tracheotomy on an older gentleman. While we had his throat open, and I had my fingers holding it open, before we inserted the stoma, I felt something move near my pelvis. I looked down, and his hand was moving under the sheets. I immediately said, this guy's hand is moving. And the surgeon said, that's okay, he's in a vegetative state. They don't even have him under anesthesia. For some reason, that freaked me out, and the old man promptly shat his pants. I worked in a lot of hospitals that saw a lot of patients that didn't have full control of their faculties, if you know what I mean. We had a woman that was constantly showing up at the hospital because she'd hurt herself or something, and she wasn't all there. One thing she talked about was a lot of having a baby. She really wanted to have a baby. This woman was in her late 40s, and she'd never had kids. And her biological clock must have been screaming at her or something. This part was all told to me after the fact, since I didn't really interact with patients outside of the OR. Anyway, one day she comes into the emergency room with a severe abdominal pain and a massive infection. When the doctor was poking around in her lower abdomen, he felt a lump. He ordered some scans and the results showed a chicken, like a whole raw chicken in her uterus. Naturally, we had to go into surgery. This is when I came in. When I read the orders, I was like, what? The surgeon must have written this wrong. When we got in, the surgeon confirmed it. We opened her up, and sure enough, there was a chicken. The crazy part, her body heat must have cooked it a bit, mostly raw, but you could tell it wasn't totally raw. The case was immediately considered a non-sterile surgery. Apparently, from what the nurses told me, this woman wanted a child so badly, she took a chicken and was somehow able to shove it up her cervix. I can only imagine the pain she went through to do that. She was clearly insane and a danger to herself, and from what I understand, she was later admitted to the inpatient wing of our psych ward. There was also another story about a guy who enjoyed shoving things up his penis, like paper clips and shit. I am a night shift nurse at a semi-rural hospital. I have had two very creepy things that have happened to me. One of our patients had recently died, and his family members left after spending some time with his body. So we do the post-mortem care and take him down to the morgue. We didn't get any more admissions that night, so it was empty until we left. The thing is, the call bell from that room would keep ringing at random times. When I went there to make sure that it was not under something, no one was messing with it, because the room was right across from the nurse's station. Still can't explain it. Tonight, I'm working. One of my patients is very ill, and she was yelling out because she said someone was looking at her from the anteroom. The anteroom is a little room next to the isolation rooms that we can put our isolation gowns or gear in. It's typically used for TB patients, if we have any, and serves as a little gateway to negative pressure rooms so the infection stays in the room. Anywho, I kind of figured it was maybe her dementia or something. The thing is, I didn't know until later that previous night, her daughter also saw someone looking in from the anteroom. Her daughter was serious as well. We've been keeping a very close eye on my patient because we're pretty sure she's not going to make it through the night. Every time we go there, other nurses or aides get a deep chill in their spine, so I'm glad I didn't come in tonight. That also happened to a friend of mine. She works in a different hospital, and she kept telling me that the call light kept on going off when there was no patient in the room. Her floors used to be PEDs in the early 1900s, and every time a patient stayed in that room, they would complain of seeing kids walking in and out of there. Her patients are all heavily sedated and post-operation, so her nurses would always come to that reasoning. The patients who stayed in the rooms almost always requested a new room, and it happened so often that they called in a priest to bless the room. She told me she thinks it worked, because since then no one else has complained, and she tells me that she's always scared walking down those hallways making the rounds at midnight to 3 a.m. I work at a world-famous hospital, and a few years ago, I used to do security here on the night shift, from 11 to 7. Well, I had heard about EVP through Coast to Coast, and I am a believer, but I need solid proof for something that's going on, and that it can't be ruled out by logical scientific reasoning. Anyway, fast forward. So every night at around 3 a.m, I would get this weird feeling, like someone was in the lobby as I walked through. I decided to take a recorder and said, if anyone is here, you can talk into this mic right here, and I will hear you, and then set the recorder down and walked away. About 45 minutes later I came back, grabbed the recorder, and went about my day. Later on that morning, I put on headphones and decided to take a listen, thinking that it was stupid and that I wouldn't hear a thing. But hey, it worked supposedly, with other people, so what the hell. I put in my headphones, and right when I said, if you talk into the mic, I can hear you, I heard a response clear as day. Thank you, and nothing else. It definitely freaked me out, as it was 3 in the morning. I was the only one in the building, and to hear a voice just really got my mind going. So I decided to take this recorder into different areas and try it more, and had a lot of success recording dozens of voices at 2 and 3 a.m. It was creepy to say the least. One time, I even put the recorder down and I said, I believe you are here and I want to communicate. I set down the recorder and walked away. When I came back, I immediately wanted to check what it said. At the point where I said I want to communicate, I heard a loud, raspy voice scream, "Stop it," which creeped me out big time. I later that night walked into another area with a recorder and, in front of my face, heard a wailing, crying scream of a woman's voice, and it lasted about 5 seconds, which literally scared the ever-loving shit out of me. I searched the area, thinking maybe someone was in distress, but there was only 3 rooms in the area, and all 3 were empty. I hopped onto a close phone and called to report what I had just heard. As I was explaining to the guy on the phone, the scream happened again, right in front of my face. Shortly after that, I went into EMT and moved on from that job. I like to think I am a pretty rational person, minus my curiosity getting the better of me, and recording things out of thin air, and having things scream out at me out of thin air, which the people on the phones also heard, so I know at least I'm not a complete loon. At any rate, that is what I went through, and it was pretty creepy to say the least. When I was about 11 years old, my mother was dying of cancer, and had been fighting for a couple of years on and off. She's in a home hospital bed, and we live with my brother. Him and his wife are out, and I'm alone with her. She was always loving, and she was my only parent, so I trusted her completely. She was always smart and aware, despite slowly losing the battle with cancer. I can hear her suddenly making weird moans, and getting up from Super Nintendo to check on her. She has a look of absolute horror on her face. "Daniel, come here. Come here. Mum, what is it? Can you see it? Do you see it?" And her eyes got all glossy, and she was staring into the hallway. "I don't see anything, Mama." "What?" "The velvet red hook, Daniel. It's right there. It's right there on the ceiling. It's looking at us." "Mama, there's no hook. It's just a ceiling." She mumbles on about the red velvet hook, and then she spins me a little look and goes, "You have to get me out of here, Daniel. They're trying to hurt me. They want to kill me." "Who, Mama? We all love you, no one is..." And then she got a wild look in her eyes. "No, you don't understand, Daniel. You have to get me out of here. They want to hurt me." I tore away from her and ran and called an adult, and I don't even remember who at the time. She spent the next few months in the hospital, barely coherent, and only had maybe one groggy moment of really being herself again before dying. But from a woman who you have trusted and known as the only constant in your life, all your life, you never forget the first time that you find her mind is failing, and that you are now alone. When I was a student nurse, I was working at an aged care facility. One late shift, I was doing my final rounds before leaving for the night. I enter the room of one of the female residents, and she's sitting on her bed staring at the wall. I encourage her to get into bed, and she looks at me and states she doesn't want to go to sleep because the man will wake her up anyway. I ask her what she means, and she explains that in the night, a man walks down the corridor and he comes into her room. She tells me that he stands in her room and stares at her. I assure her that she's safe, and as it's all a secure facility, and that no one can be here if they're not supposed to be. I help her into bed and leave. Fast forward a few nights later, and I learn that this resident is still not sleeping, and that the man keeps waking her up. Towards the end of my shift, at around 11 p.m, I'm doing my rounds again, and I hear the same resident call out. I rush to her room, thinking she has fallen, and find her sitting on the bed. She tells me that the man had just been in her room again. I ask her to describe the man, as we had male nurses and carers on the site. I thought she might have seen one of them walk past her room. And she describes an older man with grey hair and a big scar on his cheek. And I sit with her until she settles, and I leave. The next day, I talk with one of the nurses about the incident the night before, and explain how she described the man. When I mention the scar, the nurse stops and looks at me. She states that the man in the room before her had a scar on his cheek and died in his sleep. She explains that the current resident would not have met the gentleman, as he died 2 weeks before she arrived at the facility. She then goes on to say that when he was alive, he would just wander the corridors. This freaked me out a bit, as part of my job was essentially to walk around the facility in the dark, checking in on residents. At nights later, she stopped complaining about the man in her room. I've worked in medicine for nearly 20 years, so I've had some really weird shit happen. One night, we got a patient admitted for our telemetry floor from an outlying hospital. We get him all set up in a 2-bed room, but he is the only patient. He's in bed 2, and about 30 minutes after he arrives, the call light goes off. But it's bed 1's call light. Weird. So I go and check on him, and he says he's fine. There was no bed, and no call light for bed 1. Only a setup for bed 2. 15 minutes later, it goes off again. What the hell? I go back in there. Now he's looking at me all weird, but says he's fine. 15 or more minutes pass, and now it's nearing midnight, and the call light goes off again. Again, it's for bed 1. I go in there and I pull the curtain back, and the guy is blue, agonal breathing and basically dying. We call Code Blue and did CPR, but the man ended up dying, and the physician pronounced him dead at 11:59. So what's even weirder about this is that we call his wife, but she lives 2 hours away, and this is before cell phones were as popular as they are now. We leave a message. Some time goes by, and she gets the message and calls us back. The charge nurse breaks the news to her, and she's bawling, but says that she's coming back, and she drives the 2 hours back to our hospital. When she gets there, she kept saying, "He told me he was gonna die tonight." I have got a few stories. While I was still a nursing student, I was working in a very old hospital. They were renovating one of the wards, so the staff were advised that they can sleep on that ward in the completed rooms until it was opened up again. One night, I was sleeping in one of the rooms with a fellow nurse, when suddenly I hear a scream from the bathroom. I fly out of bed and find my co-nurse huddled in the corner furthest from the mirror. I shit you not. In the reflection of the mirror was a super faint, almost shadow-like figure that faded instantly. I know it wasn't one of our shadows, because there was light directly above the sunken mirror. We never slept in that ward again. On another occasion, when I was working night shift at a hospital one time, we had a patient that was living with dementia and had some serious expressions. We had her in a broder chair at the nursing station, and she was talking with my co-workers and I. We had called one of the residents to the ward so that we could get a sleeping pill for this woman, and he was in the middle of writing the order when the woman looks at us and says, "I really don't like this man." So my co-worker asked, "Oh, why not?" She responds with, "I don't know. He just gives me the weird vibes. You know what I should do? I should die on him." She then lays back in the chair, closes her eyes, and dies. We just thought she was sleeping, so we didn't check until the resident was done writing the order, and he went to check on her and said that she was dead, and kinda started laughing, saying that, wow, guess she showed me. On another occasion, I had a patient in the hospital that had stage 4 liver cancer and wound up with hepatic encephalopathy and required an ostomy. This poor guy was as yellow as can be. He was super aggressive and paranoid, and we called at least 15 cope whites a week on this one dude. Security just got to know his room number and name by the end of his 4-month stay. One day shift he was really happy and super nice with all the nurses, and then suddenly he just lost his shit. Like literally lost his shit. He barricaded the door with furniture from the room, and it took 6 security guards to bust it open and restrain the patient. I came into the room with the large-ass needle and injected it into him. As I'm holding pressure on the site, I look at the wall near the foot of the bed, and spelt across it was "Screw the new." I say it out loud, and the patient yells, "Screw the nurses, but I ran out of shit." He died a month later. And the worst part is that the stool stained the paint, and washing it didn't make it come out. So the next patient that went into the room simply sat in bed and kept reading, "Screw the new?" I am 17. I'm really insecure about myself because I have been abused by the people I love. Anyway, in May, I decided I was going to try and end my life by overdose. I was sitting in my room chilling and listening to music when all of a sudden I had a seizure and became unsteady about my life, since I knew that if I had a seizure I was going to limit what I could do as a person. So later that afternoon, I looked up on YouTube how to open a lockbox so I could get pills out, since I'd already overdosed about 3 months before, and my parents bought the lockbox to keep all my medications in order to prevent me from doing so. They got a lockbox that I learned was very easy to open if you really wanted to. So I got the box open and took about 40 pills. I will tell you though, don't do the same thing I did. I felt okay after I took them, and then after about 20 minutes went by, I started not feeling well, to the point of throwing up, and maybe 2 or 3 pills came out. Not many. I then decided I really didn't want to die anymore, and messaged the police on Facebook, since I was too scared to dial 911. When the police showed up, I was in a bad state, so they called the emergency services who came out, and by the time they got there, I was coughing up blood and was having heavy seizures. They told my parents, and I had to go to the ER with them, because I was in a life-threatening condition. They took me to the hospital, lights and sirens blazing, where many times my heart rate would drop so low they thought I was about to start coding. When we got to the ER, they had doctors waiting outside for me, and then I was rushed into the ER, where people were poking me and asking me things like, "Can you hear me? And are you in pain?" Once they stabilized me, they were able to calm me down a bit and had me get up and go to the bathroom so that I could pee into the cup they had. On my way to the bathroom, I got that feeling right before I throw up, and once I gave the urine sample, I remember I sat on the ground fighting the urge to faint. The last thing I remember was a nurse asking why I was on the ground, and then I threw up big time all over the bathroom floor, and the nurses were calling for help. I was carried back to my room. I was then carried back to the room because I was unresponsive. I woke up the next day with IVs hooked to me and a CNA looking at me with a worried face. Since I was so sick, I've had a CNA with me at all times. Soon a nurse walked in and said that they were going to be taking me upstairs where I could get some better care. The night before, I wasn't stable enough to go upstairs because there were times when I would kind of stop breathing and they freaked out my nurse and wouldn't do anything regarding transport. Once upstairs, I was still throwing up and couldn't use a bathroom, so they put a tube in me in order to pee, which hurt a lot. I was coughing up blood day and night. They gave me a medication with the hopes of reversing the overdose, which worked pretty well, but by that point I'd lost a lot of blood. So when I would get up to walk around the ward, I would faint, and they had to give me a blood transfusion. About a week went by, and I was feeling a lot better, and they were able to put me on the mental ward. I was taken across the street to a mental ward the next day, and had been there before 2 years ago for suicidal thoughts, but this time it was empty. I got to the ward and was kind of happy, because the nurse knew my name from 2 years ago, and that made me feel better. So I wouldn't have to say I was here from 2 years ago. I got my vitals taken when I showed up, and ate dinner, since by that time it was dinner time, but I wasn't really hungry. I was in pain still, but not bad enough to be in hospital. I met the 9 other kids I would be staying with. Some of them I knew I was going to hate, just by the way they greeted me. It was pretty chill for the first day because nobody felt like starting any fights until Monday rolled around, and that's when the one kid decided they didn't want to be there anymore, and, as a result, went after the rest of us. Now I get triggered by that kind of stuff, so I ran to my room crying, where a nurse came in and checked on me. I wanted to get out of there, because I couldn't trust anybody, and it's very hard to gain any trust once you lose it. A few days went by like that, because when locked away people start to get mad, so they start going after other people. About 3 days in, I was having some chest pain, and nobody really cared, which made me very angry. I told the nurse that I didn't want to be here, and that I would rather go home and be unwell than be somewhere that I didn't feel safe. I had a meeting with my family the next day, which is where I lost my shit on them, because I was done with being treated like a piece of trash that didn't matter. I was released the next day, and was told by them that it was going to be a bad idea because I would just run away. Within 72 hours of being home, I ran away and walked 3 miles away, where I took more pills that I found in my parents' room. I then called 911 and told them, and they sent the police to see what was going on since I'd been reported missing. I started throwing up, and the cops decided to get an ambulance and check me out, since it was protocol when someone runs away. They showed up and knew who I was because I have seizures, and I know all the paramedics in town. They took me back, where thank God it was a new shift, so I wouldn't be called the first class flyer, meaning that I come there a lot. I wasn't feeling well, so it meant I had to get the treatment, and they told me that I was unstable. Surprise, surprise. They let me out 2 days later because I was deemed not suicidal. You know, the hospitals here don't really give a crap about you. I'm a 4th year nursing student, and I would like to share this story. I was sitting for a 28-year-old woman who was going through alcohol withdrawal. Day 3, the worst day. Sitting is when you sit at the patient's bedside because the patient is a danger to themselves or others. She was in full restraints, with her hands and feet bound to the bed, so she couldn't physically hurt me. But she kept calling me an ugly prick and spitting all over the room. After a while, she started hallucinating. She thought she was in the car, and I was sitting in the front seat. Her 2 kids were in the back. She started talking about her kids for a while, and then started screaming and telling me to take the wheel. This scene went on for about 10 minutes, of her explaining in vivid detail the car crash that happened, and how she had killed her son. When the story was over, she kept crying and apologizing to me, and asking me to pick up her son's dead body and give it to her. She was given IV sedatives, but when those wore off, she had the same hallucination again. It replayed about 7 or 8 times over the duration of my 12-hour shift. It was extremely unsettling, because after hearing the story a few times, I could tell that this was something that actually happened, and that she was replaying the horrifying memory in her head over and over and over again, in her delirious state. Poor woman must have suffered so much. I'm glad that she finally checked into a rehab program to detox, but it's sad to think of the long journey she has in front of her, living with the fact that she killed her 7-year-old son. This is not my story, but my father's, and figured that it would be relevant to tell. I love telling this story. So basically, my dad was on his way to go pick up some pizzas from one of our favorite pizza places. He had just turned down the T intersection towards the pizza place when he heard an extremely loud crash. He turned around just in time to see a motorcycle helmet coming down from about 30 feet in the air. The driver of the motorcycle had just ran a red light and slammed right into the side of an SUV with 2 teenage girls all dressed up on their way to prom. The guy was driving way too fast, especially seeing how you can't even see the intersection until you're almost right on top of it. When he hit the side of the SUV, his face was right at the bottom of the window as the driver's side rear door. It threw his helmet off straight up into the air, shattered the window and left a huge dent in the door, and covered the interior of the car and the poor girls and their white prom dresses with specks of blood. My dad pulled over in a nearby parking lot and rushed over to help. At this point in time, a couple of people had already gotten out, but due to the man's condition, they were just standing there in shock. The man had taken almost all of the force of the crash directly to his face and around his jaw. At this point, he was laying in the middle of the intersection with blood streaming from his mouth. He was in a bad shape, but was still trying to breathe. My dad saw this and attempted to clear his airway. He used his finger to scoop out enough blood from the man's mouth so that he could breathe, and then attempted to pull his tongue and jaw down to open his airway. He described the man's chin as literally having absolutely no structure, as the bones had been pulverized. He compared the feeling of the man's jaw to a handful of mush. He continued to stabilize the man's neck and hold open his airways until the ambulance arrived. It took the ambulance a good 10 minutes to show up, and had my dad not been there to help out this guy, he surely would have been dead. He let the paramedics know his name and that he was an anesthesiologist, and gave them a quick rundown about what he already knew. Once the man had been taken away, my dad decided it was now time to wash off. He walked the short distance to the pizza place with his forearms pretty much covered completely in blood, and he said it was quite amusing to see the look on people's faces as he asked them to open the doors to the pizza place and restrooms with his arms caked in it. The man ended up suffering multiple fractures in a couple of different vertebrae and other facial features, broken collarbone, broken ribs, collapsed lung, amongst a slew of other things. Now my dad, having worked in a hospital for almost 20 years with an extremely busy emergency room, really didn't think much of it at the time. He was simply doing the kind of stuff he does on a daily basis, just outside the normal environment. I myself did not even hear about this situation until 2 days later, Now this is the coolest thing. Now this is the thing about this that I find the coolest about the whole story. Fast forward a year. 1 year to the day of the accident exactly. My dad is at work when he gets a page to come down to the main lobby. As he comes into the lobby, he notices this man is standing there, and thought he looked kind of familiar. Without much hesitation, the man comes up to my dad, wraps his arms around him, and just starts bawling. My dad instantly realized who this man was, and started crying himself. The man repeated over and over under the tears, "Thank you, you saved my life." They continued to chat a little bit about the man's physical therapy, and how it was going. I don't think they've kept in contact, but my dad said it was one of the best experiences of his life. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's installment of stories. That last one I really liked. Such a nice way to end the video. And it just goes to show that some people really do care about their profession. I think in the last hospital video I did, I'm not sure if you guys remember it, there was a story where a doctor just kept slicing and slicing a guy's hand instead of just pulling the metallic object lodged in there. He just kept cutting and cutting and cutting away bits of flesh in order for him to have a better pull. And that story just really got on my nerves because, you know, when you go to a hospital, you put your trust in these people. And if they do their job badly, it can have, you know, serious consequences on your entire life. So it's just really nice to end it on such a nice, positive story. And I hope that you enjoyed it too. I also found it quite challenging to pronounce some of the medical terms. So if you're in the field and I said it wrong, I am very sorry. Please don't forget to drop a lovely like and leave a comment down below with what you thought of the video. It would go a long way and really mean a lot to me. If you're new and haven't subscribed, I'd strongly recommend you do. I do post every night to make sure that there are new spooks waiting for you for when you go to sleep. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.